Welcome back to the final lecture of the course. We're talking about Adam Smith, another thinker in economics, actually an earlier writer than Marx. But being that we have already covered Marx and I mostly want to talk about similarities and the contrasts, I think this lecture will be relatively short because a lot of the we've already covered in the Marx lecture. This is Adam Smith. Smith was writing in the late 1700s, so he's about 50 years before. And this is sort of the height of the British colonial system. This is the time of the American Revolution and before. Um, you'll recall, right, that the British had to, were involved in a great deal of restriction on trade and where ships could come to port and so on in order to make sure that they were getting all the benefits of this colonial economy and that people were paying their taxes and everything was flowing back to the British. Right? So Smith is typically remembered today as a kind of a libertarian thinker. He was not a fan of this, what we call mercantilism, that the British were practicing, right? Trying to exert all these controls and taxes over trade. And instead, he thought that free trade was going to be the most efficient and most just form of economy. But as we'll see, compared to sort of many contemporary, more libertarian thinkers on the right, he's actually much more sensitive to the problems of the poor and of the workers, and he does advocate some degree of governmental intervention to help out right people who suffer under this system, even if he thinks there shouldn't be too much governmental interference in this overall system itself. So you'll recall Marx viewed capitalism as a necessary stage on the road to the final stage of history, which is communism. Again, he's often portrayed as an enemy of capitalism, but I think it's more accurate to say he just thought, yeah, capitalism is necessary, right? It's all these successive stages have to happen, and eventually we'll get communism. Smith's thinking on this is a bit closer to the way most of us are sort of default, which is that we're not necessarily looking towards some next stage of history, right? Things just happen when they happen. Capitalism is just sort of the air we breathe, where we exist, and it's going to continue uh, in that form, right? So for Smith, capitalism is sort of the default, and he thinks it's ultimately the most efficient and most just form of government. Marx about this, he would say, of course you think that, right? Because your mind has been warped by ideology, right? The ruling class that benefits from capitalism, that capitalism is the natural state of the world, right? But at any rate, Smith thinks, yeah, capitalism is where it's at. So, like Marx, Adam Smith puts a lot of emphasis on division of labor, right? Now, Marx traces the entire history of the world in terms of division of labor. Smith concentrates on the present day, and his main example is a pin factory. So, like pins, right? These, none of the workers there are skilled craftsmen. Each on his or her own could never in a day produce very many pens, right? If they had to pull the wire and do all the sharpening and do every single stage of the production. But what you get in the factory instead is division of labor, right? So you have one person just pulling wire all day very quickly, another one straightening, passing on, another one cutting, another sharpening, and so on. You're dealing with, at least, I think he describes at least 10 people in the factory, and certainly you can have many, many more. Um, and that form of production, you can get tens of thousands of pens, right? So whereas each person on their own might at most make like 20, right? By 10 people working together, you can have tens of thousands in a day. Productivity is increased by a huge factor. Now, also like Marx, Smith doesn't place any particularly great weight on human ideas or human consciousness, right, as sort of driving history in the way that Hegel thought. So this, innovation of the factory system, he doesn't attribute this huge increase in productivity to the genius of some person who invented it. And he says, yeah, this is just a natural consequences of what humans do. Humans are always going to make deals that are in their own interest. And if you let them keep doing that, they're going to come up with innovations and you're going to end up with increased productivity. So the basic system of trading, to advance your own interests, right? And often advancing your own interests involves advancing the interests of others, right? So if I want to make a trade with you, um, typically I'm going to want to give you a trade that's attractive to you, that you'll benefit from, and I'll benefit from. That's going to be the most efficient way and the most advantageous way to trade. And over time, right, with millions and millions and billions of people doing this, of course, you eventually develop a very efficient and productive machine and economy. So Smith pin factories are the natural result of a basic tendency of humans to want to. Since, as we've said, the productive capacity of a single person working alone is very low, follows, according to Smith, the most efficient and thus most natural system is for each person to draw a wage for doing some very specific task, for pulling wire all day and you get paid money instead of, you know, owning a bunch of pins that you made that day. And then you can use that wage for that very specific task to buy other things. The existence of private property, though, Smith, again, like Marx, thinks this alters the nature of labor. So once somebody owns something, so suppose a piece of land is owned by somebody, and therefore not owned by somebody else, now the owner can charge rent, and that rent reduces how much the renter can make in a day from their labor, right? So now it's almost like a tax on your labor. And so there's always going to be this constant tension once private property enters the situation between the desire of an owner not to want to raise wages and a worker to want to get a higher wage, right? At the very least, they want a wage that will keep them alive and allow them to, have children and family. Um, and this is right around where Smith predicts wages are going to settle, right? Wages are going to end up around the spot where the worker is able to survive, is able to reproduce, not a whole much else, not a whole lot else, right? Wages are not going to typically be so high that the worker can afford to buy their own land or their own tools and under themselves. So this, I don't know if you recognized it in the reading, right? The invisible hand of the market. So this is a very common, popular phrase. Um, it's the idea that if we just let capitalism do its thing, right, it will kind of guide us towards very different than what Marx thought, right? I mean, he thought it would guide us to the ultimate collapse of capitalism. Um, he thought that this fact that workers are never going to rise above a certain level um, of wealth embodied this central contradiction that's ultimately going to be the end and going to cause a revolution. Um, but Smith thinks no, it's this is the most efficient place. It's going to settle at that state where the workers are going to make just enough to survive, right? And that's actually the most efficient things to settle. The person is working in their own interest in this whole system, but he thinks the net result is going to be an overall system with immense productivity that enriches society as a whole. Of course, none of this sounds great for the workers, and Smith is aware of this, right? He's aware that workers are going to be suffering under his perfectly efficient system, right? Wages are kept to a minimum, not to mention, right, that pulling wire all day is going to have cause detrimental effects on your body and your mind, right? It's a pretty stultifying and exhausting sort of way to live your life, 8 hours a day, if not more. So, although Smith was opposed to the mercantilism of the British, and he thinks that government should largely stay out of the affairs of business, he does recognize that without some sort of government intervention, workers will be driven to an intolerable state. So, a lot of similarities between Smith and Marx. Why is it that Smith doesn't then predict some sort of revolution, right? If the situation for workers sounds like unlivable, why would well, it's kind of yet to be seen who's correct, right? So, um, Marx and Smith have very similar premises. They share a lot of beliefs about the nature of the economy. Smith thinks that in the end, we're going to stop at capitalism because it's the most efficient, right? And maybe the government will get in there and just make sure that workers don't revolt, right? Um, so far, that seems to be the case. I mean, there have been communist revolutions, right, in Russia, China, Vietnam, But on the whole, it seems like the world is mostly communist, and for the most part, yeah, right, the bottom rung of workers don't do that well, and we do have government programs that keep them from revolting, right? So maybe that's the case, and maybe Smith is right, but we'll have to see, right? One important thing that Smith pointed out is like workers need to not just be able to survive, but also be able to have families, right, for the human race to continue. This seems to be a problem right now. Birth rates, at least in the U.S., do seem to be declining because people are having trouble affording children. So it might be the case the wages are slipping below what Smith predicted, and either we'll see. Either the government will step in and help out, or maybe market, right? Maybe there'll be some sort of revolution. Right. Well, then again, I promised a short lecture, so that's it for today. And I will be in touch as your final papers due and your final. And thanks again.